Hello, everyone. So for week 5, we have a little bit of overlap here. Um, so I covered in week 4 video, I covered Sonata, Rondo, Minuet, and Trio. So be sure to look at that video. There were like there's an extra video. So that can kind of be week 4, week 5 for the theory. This week, we are going to be talking about the church and storm styles, which are both easy enough to notice. Haydn and the Symphony as well. And then for our listening lab, we have movements 3 and 4 of the Emperor String Quartet. Hopefully you remember what we talked about from movement 1 and 2. We had kind of a heavy week last week, and this is going to be sort of the end before we start getting ready for the final, for the quarterfinal. Okay, so let's begin. So we should already have built a classical introduction notes page. We talked about all that. We talked about our listening for movements 1 and 2. We're starting to build a little bit of a terms list for the things that we might not know about. Of course, we have all of our forms that we've been talking about as well. So we are going to begin. So this would be Haydn and the Symphony, which I'm probably, since I'm kind of at the bottom of my page, I'm going to just make a new page. All right, so let's get started. So we are doing 8, 9, 13 through 17, and 22. So sounds like a lot of pages, but really there's a lot of pictures and things. So, all right. The orchestra. The orchestra during the Baroque period consisted mainly of strings, 2 groups of violins, violas, cellos, and a few basses. There was always a keyboard instrument, either harpsichord or organ, and sometimes flutes, oboes, bassoons, and trumpets might be added. In the classical orchestra, the strings still occupied a predominant place, and their number depended on the wealth of the orchestra's sponsor. There might be as many as 12 first violinists and 12 seconds, 6 violists, 8 cellists, and 4 basses. That's a pretty large orchestra. On the other hand, some orchestras managed with only 3 or 4 first violins and the same number of seconds, 2 violas, 2 cellos, and only 1 bass. Now, one thing you need to know is that it takes a lot of strings to balance a couple trumpets or trombones. So one really strong trumpet can play louder than 20 strings. So if you're asking yourself, why are there so many string players? That's why, because it's just the brass in particular can really overpower a string section. The keyboard instrument, however, lost its orchestral role because it was no longer needed to play the continuous bass part that played such an important role in Baroque music. Another change was that the woodwind and brass sections were given a more important role within the orchestra as solo instruments. Clarinets were now added to the wind section because the new improved clarinet was able to stay in tune throughout its full range. French horns were the mainstay of the brass section, although trumpets were sometimes used too. As for the percussion section, the only kind of drums used were timpani or kettle drums, unless a Turkish sound was wanted. If so, cymbals, triangle, and bass drum would be added. There was a certain fascination with Turkey at the time, and composers often added sounds influenced by Turkish music to get an exotic effect. Mozart did so in his comic opera The Abduction from the Seraglio, as did Haydn in his Military Symphony and Beethoven in his Symphony No. 9. So what do we learn from that? Classical orchestras did not have a keyboard instrument and used wind and, I should say, woodwind and brass instruments more frequently than the Baroque. So all that whole page, we pretty much got into one sentence, okay? Next, wind instruments provide the sounds in various registers. Flutes, clarinets, and oboes make high sounds, bassoons, low ones. The brass instruments are in the middle range. These instruments could be added to the strings when the composer wanted more volume. As well, each type of instrument added its own particular color of sound. Composers carefully combined the different colors of sound to get effects they wanted. So the early classical orchestra would have a lot of violins and violas, cellos, basses, pairs of woodwinds, pairs of brass, and two timpani, which would be played by one person. Virtuoso orchestras. So here's a term that we're going to need to get used to. Virtuoso means, we go back up to our terms list. Virtuoso means something, well, we could just say a person that greatly excels at their craft, which it's kind of general, but that kind of covers everything. So when we say virtuoso or virtuosic, it means, well, we're about to learn what it means. And the new music being written for orchestras required a very high level of playing, and some orchestras began to gain a reputation for their skill. One particularly famous one in Mannheim, Germany, played with such exciting crescendos that a writer of the time reported that audiences would rise to their seats as the music grew louder. This one orchestra influenced the way music was written and played all over Europe. Okay, now we're talking a little bit about Haydn. Joseph Haydn was born in a modest home in the village of Rohrau, about 30 miles outside of Vienna, Austria. Haydn's father made wheels for carts and carriages, but he loved music and often sang and accompanied himself on the harp. Young Joseph learned to sing his father's songs, and his beautiful voice was noticed by his uncle Johann Frank, a schoolmaster. Frank suggested that Joseph should come to his school and sing in the parish church choir. So at the age of 6, Haydn left home. While he was at his uncle's school, the choirmaster of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna heard him sing and was so impressed with his ability that he asked the boy, who was then 8 years old, to come and study at the choir school attached to the cathedral. Wow. Vienna was one of the most important musical centers in the world in those days, so it was a very great opportunity. The choir boys at St. Stephen's had to sing at 2 church services every day, as well as for weddings, funerals, and other special occasions. Their education consisted of religion, Latin, mathematics, and writing, plus studies in singing, violin, and harpsichord. When his voice began to break, or change, as we say, Haydn was dismissed from the choir and had to try and make a living as a freelance musician. So, Haydn was a gifted singer. He quickly became noticed by important musicians and studied singing, violin, and the keyboard at an early age. Add Haydn came from a musical family. Not all musicians come from a musical family, and was a gifted singer. Great. So we can see he's at the choir school. He begins his career, you know, kind of early. I mean, think about it. Starting your career when you're 16. It's kind of crazy. All right. Hard times and modest success. Haydn was very poor, and he took almost any job he could find. He bought himself an old harpsichord and did a little teaching, sang as a tenor at a nearby church, and played violin at parties and private concerts. During this difficult time, he studied music theory on his own and learned a great deal by working through the keyboard sonatas of C.P.E. Bach, so as one of Bach's sons. He took some lessons from the well-known Italian singer, master and composer Nicola Porpora, and became his accompanist, and at times his personal servant. Haydn credited him with teaching him the fundamentals of composition. Through Porpora, Haydn began to meet wealthy Austrian noblemen who commissioned him to compose for them. And in 1759, he obtained his first salary position as music director to Count Morzine. During this period, Haydn married Maria Anna Keller, the daughter of a wig maker. Yeah, wigs were really important back in the day. Haydn's wife was not interested in music and never really valued his work. Oh, that's sad. The marriage did not turn out well, and they never had any children. Well, that kind of makes sense, have a supportive husband or wife. Okay, that's kind of interesting stuff. So he learned composition from an Italian guy and also from Bach. Appointment to the court of the Esterhazies in 1761. So he's like 30. He's just about to turn 30. Haydn accepted the position of assistant music director at the court of Prince Paul Anton Esterhazy, one of the richest noblemen in Hungary. The Esterhazies were great patrons of the arts, and Haydn stayed in the service of the Esterhazy family for almost 30 years. He worked for 4 Esterhazy princes: Prince Paul Anton, Prince Nicholas, Prince Anton, Prince Nicholas II. Not particularly creative in their naming of princes, right? Okay, so Haydn was first based at the Esterhazy's castle at Eisenstadt, Austria. Musicians were still regarded as servants in those days, and Haydn was given a salary and provided with a room and given his meals at the servants' table. He had to compose anything the prince required, rehearse the orchestra, and take care of the music and the instruments. In addition, Prince Paul Anton owned the rights to all of Haydn's compositions. The prince did not live long enough to enjoy much of Haydn's music, however. He died within a year of Haydn's arrival and was succeeded by his brother, Prince Nicholas. It was written into his first contract that he must wear the uniform of a court officer, wear a wig or powder, and braid his hair, maintain standards of morality and sobriety, and avoid vulgarity in eating, drinking, or speaking. Okay. So, Haydn began his career with the very wealthy Esterhazies. Wow. You know that the Esterhazies are important when you type Esterhazies into Word and it doesn't think it's a wrong word. That's something. Look at that. Anyhow, yes. And so Haydn against Europe, the very wealthy Esterhazy in Austria. He was still considered a servant and not a famous composer. He worked under this family for the bulk of his career. The established composer. Okay, now we're talking. Haydn's reputation as a composer grew steadily. He had been publishing his compositions for some years, so even though he had been isolated at Esterhazy, that's kind of the name of their place, his music was very popular. When he was asked to do a concert series in London, England, he agreed to compose an opera, 6 symphonies, and several other concert works, and to go to London to conduct these works. Haydn very much enjoyed the rich cultural life in London. People made a great fuss over him, and he met everyone who mattered. When Haydn returned to Vienna, he was an international celebrity with a Doctor of Music degree from Oxford University. Ooh, Dr. Haydn. Haydn went back to London for another concert season 2 years later, which was again very successful. He became a favorite of the British royal family. At the end of his life, Haydn was able to live in Vienna. He continued to compose and conduct and publish new works. When his wife died in 1800, Haydn was too old to remarry. Living alone in his house in Vienna, he was much valued by the Viennese people. He was made an honorary citizen of Vienna and received honors from royalty. Haydn was not strong in these later years. His final appearance as a conductor was in 1803, when he was carried in a sedan chair to attend his last concert in 1808. Haydn grew progressively weaker until he died in May of 1809. It was reported that the whole art-loving world of Vienna attended his memorial service. Haydn had the opportunity to visit London and conducted new concert works for the British people and the royal family favored him. He, after London, he was at the end of his life and career and was beloved by, we'll say all in quotes, maybe not everyone loved him, but let's just say that's the idea, beloved by all in Vienna. All is a very strong word. Okay, so I hope, we're in week 5 now. I hope that those of you who are doing these reading guides with me are starting to learn how we read, how we find the important things. Not everything is super important to remember, to memorize, to think about. All the details are very interesting, of course, but we don't need to necessarily know every little thing. Okay, and now we're getting back into the symphony. These things, 17, 18, 19, 20, these, the explanations of these things occur in last week's videos. So if you have questions about 17 through 20, go ahead and go into last week's videos. And let me just double check that we've covered everything for week 5. 22. It looks like we need 22. I thought so. I thought there was maybe one thing we didn't have. Aha, chamber music. Okay, perfect. Chamber music. Chamber music is written for small ensembles and designed to be played, as its name suggests, in a smaller place than would be required for a full orchestra. So a chamber is like a room. This kind of music may be written for various instruments in duets, trios, quartets, quintets, and even more. Large ensembles were possible. Beethoven wrote a septet for winds, and Mozart an octet, also for winds. But the most common combination of instruments was the string quartet. And of course, that's the piece that we're looking at with Haydn, is the string quartet. A string quartet contains 4 instruments, 2 violins, a viola, and a cello. This provides a balance of high and low registers, and since they all belong to the same family of instruments, they fit together perfectly. The music written for string quartets tends to follow the same four-movement and tempo pattern as the symphony. Mozart composed 30 string quartets, Beethoven 16, and Haydn 67. That's a lot. That's why he's called the grandfather of the symphony. That's a lot of symphonies, people. Okay, so chamber music was written for smaller ensembles. String quartets were the most popular and follow the symphony form. Haydn is known as the grandfather of the symphony because he wrote 67 of them. It's a ton of symphonies. Okay, we're going to save our classical notes. This is the last reading guide of this particular unit. So we've covered in just a couple pages. We've got all of our classical stuff in there. Hopefully you do too. And we will see you for the third and fourth movement in our listening lab. See you soon.